Forever Chemicals, a presentation by Andrea Reisinger. A forever chemical describes a chemical that has a very long life in the ecosystem that cannot be easily broken down, i.e., why they have been named forever chemicals. The history of forever chemicals has changed over time. In the 1930s, there was the introduction of forever chemicals with their use as coatings for tanks and military weapons, as they did not weather like normal metal when left outdoors. In 1946, there was the introduction of Teflon to cookware. These chemicals were introduced during the time when new technologies were seen as a new marvel, in this case, non-stick cooking. In 2000, Teflon stopped using C8, their original PFAS, and replaced it with C6 due to environmental and human health concerns. In 2001, Teflon chemicals were found in tens of thousands of people's drinking water near a plant. Currently, PFAS are in essentially everything that has to be water resistant, stick resistant, and oil resistant. Think of raincoats, pans, popcorn bags, and pizza boxes. Massive amounts of PFAS, a type of forever chemical, is released from firefighting foams and many other sources. 98 to 99% of individuals have detectable levels of PFAS in their blood. High levels of PFAS may cause harmful health effects like cancer, liver damage, infertility, increased asthma, and thyroid disease. These health effects occur in many animals as well as humans. Forever chemicals also act as greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Since they do not break down, they have a heavy greenhouse effect associated with them. PFAS has 6,000 to 9,000 times more warming per molecule in the atmosphere than CO2. We don't know much about PFAS in terms of wildlife, but it doesn't look good. The ocean has become a PFAS sink where chemicals reside for decades or longer. Some scientists think we have no idea what's happening, and for all we know, oceans could be reservoirs that repollute the land with PFAS. Next, we turn to an interview with Notre Dame professor Kyle Dowdrick, who does research with PFAS.
Hey, awesome. We are here with Professor Kyle Dowdrick to talk about PFAS, which is one of his specialties. Professor Dowdrick, what is one thing you think is missing from the scientific knowledge of PFAS in the environment, specifically in terms of air pollution and air quality?
Okay, so PFAS and air, I like it. Yeah, so I would say that probably this is kind of a big question because maybe the answer is a lot of stuff, right? So there's a lot of unknowns in the scientific community and with regards to knowledge when it comes to PFAS and air. I would say the biggest unknown though is maybe just where are the sources and then how much is being released to the air. So if you consider, how PFAS can enter the environment, probably the two main ways are, the main source is probably consumer products, and also the use of the chemicals in industry. So we just think about consumer products. So you can think about you using a jacket or a food container or whatever it may be, eventually it's going to end up in the trash. And then when it ends up in the trash, it's either going to go to a landfill or an incinerator. If it's in a landfills actually generate what's called landfill gas. And it's been shown that those landfill gases actually contain a lot of different PFAS. And then once it gets in the air, it can be widespread throughout the environment. And if it doesn't go in a landfill, we typically incinerate the waste. And if you incinerate it, you can create PFAS byproducts, or maybe just the PFAS themselves aren't completely destroyed. And then they may pass through the post-treatment processes, and that also ends up in the air. So I think, there's a lot of unknowns, like how much is entering in the air, what products exactly contain the PFAS. There's a lot of products where we don't even know if they have PFAS or not. They just say they're waterproof or thermally resistant or whatever it may be. And there's been studies that have shown we find PFAS as, all the way up to the Arctic, just really far reaching areas or in polar bear blood, et cetera. And that's due just to the fate and transport of the PFAS once it gets into the air. So that's probably the biggest kind of scary thing is just, where's it coming from? And then how much is it?
Okay, awesome. And then next, you kind of touched on this, but what do you think is one thing missing from the general public's knowledge of PFAS?
Yeah, so I mean, it is related, but I think from the public standpoint, so if I'm thinking like, what does my mom need to know? It would just be, yeah, what products have PFAS? So because there are no regulations for PFAS, anybody can put whatever they want with regards to PFAS in their products. So textiles, food packaging is another big one. And as a consumer, it should be up to me to be able to make the decision about what I purchase and what I use, especially if we find that a lot of these PFAS are toxic. That's pretty scary to me as a consumer. So that would be my one thing.
Okay, awesome. And finally, do you think current regulations on forever chemicals are enough, or do you think new policies need to be enacted for consumer protection in the environment?
Yeah, I think you can probably already guess my answer here. It's absolutely not, because there are no regulations. So the first two PFAS were these what has been historically referred to C8 PFAS, so PFOA and PFOS, and those were voluntarily the manufacturing of those was voluntarily stopped by companies like DuPont and 3M, et cetera. Okay, so those weren't regulated, but they were stopped. But the thing is those companies just decided to replace those with what we call C6, or next generation PFAS. And now we're finding those everywhere, and we're finding that those are toxic, just as toxic, but in different ways. And that's what you find now in your consumer products. So there's a couple of agencies within the United States government that could regulate this stuff, right? So there's like the Clean Air Act, there's the Clean Water Act, there's the Safe Drinking Water Act, there's RCRA, which is landfills, and every one of these agencies has to set their own regulations. And the only one that's kind of making headway right now is probably the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is on the horizon right now. We have, I want to say it's 6 PFAS that are potentially going to be regulated for treated drinking water. But there's also like the Clean Water Act, for example. So imagine that you're using these consumer products, maybe it's a makeup or something in your soap or whatever it may be, and it's going to eventually end up in the wastewater treatment plant. Okay. And once it's in the wastewater treatment plant, if it's not treated there, it'll go into your rivers and streams, or maybe it's removed in the biosolids, and then we spread those on land, and then you have runoff that ends up in the rivers and streams, right? That would be protected under the Clean Water Act. And that's unlikely going to happen, right? Because that would have a trickle-down effect that impacts a lot of industry. And the other one is the Clean Air Act. And the Clean Air Act right now does have a bill in Congress that is awaiting a vote, and that it would regulate just about any PFAS compound would be regulated. That one's probably not going to pass. So I'm going to be a little bit of a cynic here. I doubt it's going to pass because it's too broad. It covers too many PFAS. So it'll probably be narrowed before it gets passed. But essentially what that would say is we now have regulations on the exhaust or the effluent of incinerators. So looking at PFAS, and that's a huge one. So that would shut down a lot of incinerator operations, actually.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, no problem.